All right, for the final segment of episode 4, we're going to bring back a segment that we did a couple episodes ago called Top Teens. And for those who might not have caught that episode, the way that it works is that, it's very common for film enthusiasts to make lists. But the problem with that is that a lot of times when people make lists of their favorite westerns or their favorite film noirs or their favorite musicals, 5 of this, 10 of that, you see the same names over and over and over. And let's be honest, if you're watching this podcast, you've probably heard of those usual suspects. So the idea behind doing top teens was the idea that we would try to find, dig a little deeper and find the deep cuts of a particular subset of films. Maybe introduce you to some things that you might not have heard of. For this week's Top Teens segment, the topic that we're going to be exploring is silent dramas. We think of the sound era coming in basically around 1928, 1929, but the thing is that silent films remained popular in other parts of the world well into the 30s. So actually a couple of the films that are on the Top Teens list are films from the 30s. Because this is Top Teens, some of the films that normally get discussed when you talk about the great silent dramas, movies like Sunrise by F.W. Murnau, or Sergei Eisenstein's The Battleship Potemkin, or let's see, what is another one? Carl Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. Those movies are not going to be in Top Teens because those movies, to be quite honest, are normally in that first dozen. So they're not going to get recommended on Top Teens. But like I said, if you're watching this, you've already heard of those movies most likely. All right, let's get on with it and check out the list. All right, so we'll kick off our list of great silent dramas with Blind Husbands by Erich von Stroheim. Now, Stroheim currently, modern day, is probably best known for the fact that he made another silent film called Greed, which famously no longer exists in its original form. However, in comparing Stroheim's career to that of Orson Welles, oftentimes people say that one of the things that they have in common is the fact that they both were able to make their first films relatively unfettered. And in the case of Welles, that's Citizen Kane. And with von Stroheim, that is actually a movie called Blind Husbands. Now, if you haven't seen Blind Husbands, it's a pretty nasty piece of work. It's about a husband and a wife who go off to this resort. I believe it's in the Swiss Alps. And Stroheim plays this guy that basically steals this guy's wife. There was a documentary made about Stroheim called The Man You Love to Hate. And it's kind of interesting the fact that he would make this first film and he would put himself as what is essentially the villain. And he would begin to sort of film that, he would begin to stoke that persona as, this vaunted villain, this guy that, was just like a real heel. He would just swoop in and take your woman from you. But it's a brilliant film. It's absolutely captivating. I believe it's from 1919, which I think a lot of people would go like, wow, that's really early. Because I think we tend to think that with silent films, the closer you get to 1928 or 1929, the better the films are. But if there's ever been an argument against that idea, it's Blind Husbands one. And for my money, it's among the very best of the silent films. And like I said, it's not nearly as heralded as Greed is because, everybody is just so desirous of someday that we'll get our hands on this original cut of Greed, which, by all indications was destroyed after a few dozen people saw it at an advanced screening. But Blind Husbands, on the other hand, does very much exist in its intended form. I don't believe it's ever been released on Blu-ray. My personal copy is of a DVD that was released in Germany by a label called Editions Film Museum. yeah, no, it's if you have not seen this movie, I would definitely say check it out. Um, for the number 14 movie on the list, it's a film by Yasujiro Ozu, and it's called I Was Born But. And it's funny because with Ozu, we tend to think of him. He's probably best known for the films that he was making in the 50s, like Tokyo Story and Good Morning and An Autumn Afternoon, and many of those films are in color. But Ozu, he was directing during the silent era, which in Japan extended into the 30s. I believe I Was Born But I want to say it was maybe 1931. So, yeah, and the thing is, if you're a fan of Ozu, if you've seen Good Morning, the storyline for I Was Born But is there's similarities there. It follows these two young boys, and at the beginning of the movie, they sort of look up to their father. And then, they kind of see what his situation is as far as his professional relationship, and it kind of diminishes him in their eyes. Don't want to get too spoilery, but this is a film that is a terrific silent film from a director who's not necessarily known as a silent filmmaker, but absolutely worth checking out. I believe in the United States this was released on a Criterion Eclipse set, and I think in the UK, I think BFI put it out. All right, so moving on to the 15th film on our top teens list is a movie called The Goddess, which is a mainland Chinese film which received a DVD release from BFI, I want to say a year or two ago. To my knowledge, it does not have any Blu-ray releases. And I saw the film actually at the Billy Wilder Theater a few years ago at the Hammer Museum. They did a series of films from China dating way back into the silent era. And this is a film, again, I believe this one came out in 1934. And but it's still a silent film because in China silent films were still a thing in 1934, and the actress whose name I'm not even going to attempt to butcher, she has this very sort of Greta Garbo-esque kind of quality to her. It's a magnificent performance, and she's terrific, and I would say for that alone, this movie is worth seeking out. She's incredible. And again, if you have a multi-region player and you can get your hands on BFI's DVD, or if there's a way to see it streaming, I can't recommend this enough. You will definitely enjoy this movie. Moving on to number 16 on our top teens list, the next movie is called A Girl in Every Port. And this is a film that features Louise Brooks before she went to Germany and made Pandora's Box with G.W. Pabst. And it's also a film, it was an early directorial effort by Howard Hawks, who had worked at MGM as a writer, and so he eventually transitioned into becoming one of the great directors of the 30s. But this is an early silent film by him. I believe it was from 1928. And one of the stars of the film is a former prizefighter named Victor McLaughlin, who this was before he made a movie called The Informer with John Ford in 1936. So a lot of folks in this movie that would go on to become much more renowned, but it's a really great movie. I saw it at LACMA probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Very entertaining movie. And again, I feel like there's a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't like silent movies. They're slow and they're boring. Like, no, this is a crackling film. You will, if you see this movie, if you manage to see it, you will love it because it's great. For number 17, it's a movie that I actually just saw for the first time a couple weeks ago. For a long time, I've wanted to see an early Italian epic called Cabiria. I believe the movie's from 1914. And I know a lot of people know about how The Birth of the Nation was the first film that was shown inside the White House, but it's actually not the first film that was shown at the White House. Cabiria, an Italian epic film, was actually shown on the White House lawn in 1914, and supposedly D.W. Griffith, who was someone who actually knew President Wilson, was so taken by the film that he decided that the movie that he was currently working on at the time was going to have to be expanded and be add on a couple of additional storylines. And that's how Intolerance came to be, was because Griffith had seen Cabiria and was so impressed by it. This is a movie that, again, I feel like there's lots of innovations there. Now, granted, it doesn't have like the cross-cutting or as many of the close-ups, so it's not as easy for film professors to be like, I can understand why they still use Birth of a Nation to kind of show a lot of those early techniques. But for my money, I would much rather see Cabiria than Birth of a Nation. To be honest with you, I've tried to watch Birth of a Nation like 3 or 4 times, and I've never gotten more than 45 minutes into it. I just find it boring. But Cabiria was fantastic. Kino did a DVD of it quite a while ago. I think it might even be out. I don't actually know. It's not out of print. I went on their website recently and saw that they had it. So if your local video store doesn't have it for rent, I know that the streaming site Vudu has an option where you can either pay to rent it, or if you're willing to put up with commercials, you can actually watch it for free. Closing out our list of the top teen silent dramas, we're going to next talk about a movie by the great female director Germaine Dulac. She's a French director who mostly worked during this silent era. She made a film called Le Cigarette. I first saw this movie last year when I rented the set that Flickr Alley put out of early women filmmakers. Unfortunately, of the films in that set, this was probably the one that had sustained the most damage. But honestly, for my money, it was the best movie in the set. It was absolutely entrancing. I loved it. Dulac is a figure where it's kind of interesting how when you look at which of her films have become the ones that have been championed over the years, a lot of that has been based on accessibility. But this is one that I feel like if somehow we had a version of it that was in better shape, this film I think would get a lot more attention. Coming in at number 19 is an early collaboration between the great director Todd Browning and a star that he worked with frequently, Lon Chaney, but that's Lon Chaney Sr., not Lon Chaney Jr. The film is called The Wicked Darling, and again, this is a film that, as it currently exists, it's in a pretty compromised state. There are some segments that are no longer in existence. I saw this at the Egyptian Theater probably about 2 or 3 years ago, and despite the fact that the film in its given state, it's a great film. It is very entertaining. Lon Chaney is one of the great stars of the silent era. These two, I believe, director Todd Browning and Lon Chaney, I believe they worked together like 6 or 7 times. And while there are other films that they made together that might be of a higher profile, honestly, I just really love this one the best. I mean, for what there is of it, it's just really great, and it's not as high profile. So that's why I felt like this should be the one that I should recommend, because I feel like it's going to take some looking for, and so that's why I wanted to give that one love. Whereas something like The Unholy Three, or like The Penalty or The Blackbird is a little easier to get your hands on. But I really am a fan of The Wicked Darling, and of course, Todd Browning is probably best known as the director of Freaks and of Dracula. But and I'm not saying The Wicked Darling is on a level with those films. I mean, those are masterpieces. But if you're a fan of Browning and or Chaney, hunt this thing down. You will not regret it. All right, so that's it for this current episode. Hope you enjoyed these segments, and hope that you found this list entertaining. Thanks. See you next time.